Canada invests less per worker than any other advanced country. And capital intensity, or the weight of a firm's assets such as plants, property, and equipment, is declining relative to the U.S., says Jock Finlayson. Worse yet, he goes on to say Canadian firms are instead boosting investment outside of Canada. That, however, is just one element of a flight of capital in Canada. The other kick in the teeth is that we lag far behind other OECD countries in attracting foreign investment in business or enterprises. A recently published C.D. Howe Institute study titled Declining Vital Signs, Canada's Investment Crisis, says Canada's stock of business capital is not even keeping pace with workforce growth. Ominous in its implication for current and future productivity. The report points out Canadian workers will have less capital, less non-residential building and engineering, less M&E, and less in the way of IP products with which to produce goods and services, earn incomes, and fund public programs in the years to come. I invited Jock Finlayson, the past chief economist at the Business Council of BC, to join me for a conversation that matters about how Canada is becoming a less attractive place to invest for international and domestic investors, and why British Columbia is even less attractive. Jock, welcome.
Pretty gloomy introduction. But
it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
What happened? How did we get to this point, and how come it seems to have been slipping under the radar?
Well, there's a lot of moving parts to it, and I think obviously the COVID crisis has preoccupied our decision makers, understandably. Earlier, pre-COVID, we went through some very big adjustments in global energy markets, and that had pretty powerful reverberations within Canada. We're a major energy producer and exporter. And
so this is like 2014, 2015, when we saw that drop in oil prices?
Yeah, it's sort of the 4 to 5 years before COVID. Commodity cycles moved around, but we went through a big adjustment, kind of an acceleration of the low carbon push. Canada, a lot of global companies actually selling off their Canadian assets. We saw that very, very dramatically. And a lack of new investment from offshore investors in our energy business, plus some high profile battles over things like the TMX pipeline, and some other big projects that really, I think, put a cloud, not just over the energy business, but it really spread to hurt Canada's broader reputation, because energy is 1/4 of Canada's exports, and it drives, up until now, it has driven a lot of our growth in investment and business profitability. And it's obviously facing a very different future as we look ahead.
You know as well as I do, there's a whole bunch of people who go, hallelujah, we're moving away from that fossil fuel generated business. But the signal that we're sending about doing business in Canada when we're so almost laissez-faire about what is one of our single largest sectors, what kind of signal does that send?
I think it's negative. I mean, the low carbon transition has started, and we have to be part of that, and that's got some implications for our industrial base and our export mix, and it poses huge challenges to the fossil fuel companies and the thousands of businesses that are linked into them. But if you look at all the projections I've seen, the world is going to continue to consume fossil fuels, perhaps in a diminishing quantum, although even that's not clear.
That's up for
but the
debate.
world's going to keep consuming fossil fuels, certainly for the next 20 or 25 years. And so if we decide we're going to accelerate the shutdown of our #1 export industry, that's going to hurt us. That won't help the global climate or environment. The markets we cede will simply be taken by the U.S., Russia, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and other energy
Venezuela
suppliers.
and so on.
And I've asked a number of people in the environment movement, including some academics, to explain to me how that scenario is good for either Canada or the global environment, and they can't. They don't want to address it. So that tells you something, I think.
But it causes you great concern about what it's doing to our reputation and also our ability to generate the kind of income that's needed to move into those next stage industries.
Absolutely. The low carbon transition will be led by the existing energy industry. It's not going to be led by flag waving civil society groups and environmental advocacy organizations or small boutique companies. It'll actually be led by the Shells, the Suncors, the CNRLs, the Cenovus's here in Canada, and similar companies abroad. And they are investing huge sums of money in low carbon transitions, both to mitigate their environmental impact today, but also to line themselves up for new businesses tomorrow. So we need these companies not only to produce what they're producing today, but to actually fund our own low carbon transition. And I think government understands that, but they don't tend to articulate it very clearly.
You think they understand it?
Maybe I'm living in hope, but I think they kind of get that to some extent. It's so obvious that who's got the know-how, the engineering talent, and the capital? The answer is the big energy companies and their suppliers.
And the ability to distribute that energy, whatever form it might take, because distribution is always a big part of any kind of energy equation.
It is, and the challenges that are posed by that are immense. Just consider this. If we're going to reduce our own emissions in Canada significantly, as our governments continue to claim we're going to do, we're going to have to electrify large parts of the energy system by shifting to electricity for transportation, potentially for home heating and things like that, that currently are sourced through fossil fuel forms of energy. That will require a huge build-out of electricity production and the related transmission infrastructure. Have a look across Canada today at the struggles in BC, in Manitoba, in Newfoundland and Labrador, among other places, in trying to build new electricity infrastructure and generating facilities. It's incredibly difficult. It takes way longer than people think, and the cost overruns sort of blow your mind. So we're faced with some big issues. I don't think our decision makers really grasp any of this from what I've seen. They think you can pass a law, flip a switch, and off we are, to the low carbon transition. And it's going to happen, but it's going to be bumpy. And I hope that at the end of it, we haven't dramatically reduced our standard of living, and that is kind of what I'm concerned about.
As you're saying that, I'm reminded about the fact that it took more than 50 years to go from the horse to the automobile as the primary source of transportation in North America, and we were, dramatically replacing a less efficient form of transportation, and it still took 50 years.
Yeah.
We're in a far more complex environment now. To do that, as you point out, we need to have that kind of investment into the country. But we're running into a regulatory environment that makes the investment of anything, especially if it has to do with energy, I don't care what form of energy it is, makes it almost impossible to do it. And for those companies that are looking at Canada, even Canadian companies are going, yeah, but I could do the same thing that much easier in the United States or somewhere else. Is this a big concern?
Yeah, I would make, Canada's not a basket case, so we do have some areas of strength. And I think it's really important to make a distinction between what I call the permit economy and the non-permit economy. The permit economy is industries which, in order to build anything or even operate an existing company, have extensive interface with government and its regulatory agencies. That part of our economy is really struggling, and that's where a lot of the problems are in Canada. Even though we're an incredibly resource-rich country, we've made it extraordinarily difficult to actually develop and market and produce our resource goods. The non-permit economy, which is mostly sort of the high-tech sector, the digital economy, creative industries, professional scientific technical services, which is rapidly growing here in BC, the companies in these sectors tend to have a lot less to do with government, and they find Canada more appealing as a place to invest. So my rule is the more you've got to deal with government and its entities and its regulatory bodies, the harder it is to justify putting capital into Canada. If you're in a line of business where government doesn't matter that much, Canada actually looks relatively a lot better. So we're really dealing with kind of a bifurcated business environment. The problem for Canada is that 2/3 of our exports are coming out of the permit economy. And this is something that I think we need to pay a little bit more attention to. We don't want those industries to sort of shrink too quickly because they're paying a lot of the bills that we're using to finance our standard of living today. And if we're going to shrink them over time, we need to focus very, very aggressively on building up new kind of engines of wealth creation and export receipts. And so I don't see our government's quite grappling with that in the way I'd like to see yet.
Well, that takes incredibly innovative thinking. I think back to what the state of California did in the 1950s and early 1960s, which in essence created Silicon Valley. They had a big, bold vision, and they helped work with business to create what is the high-tech center of the world. Do we have that same kind of vision? And I guess this is a way of me leading into my next question. Like, do governments in Canada seem to appreciate the role that business plays in being able to build out an economy, sustain a society, and fund public programs?
I think the picture is mixed, but the California example does highlight the fact that empirically, the state, through its various entities, including universities, has historically played an important role in driving innovation. So it's not just the market, it's not just companies. It's actually companies working with government where it makes sense to do so. So that's important. So this isn't about, you know, business good, government bad. It's about what do we want to do as a country? What businesses do we want to be in? What is the vision for the Canadian economy in the future? I really struggle to see that the current government in Ottawa, the re-elected Trudeau government, has grasped the nettle on that. I read the recent throne speech. Normally I read it twice. This time I just only read it once. And it was completely silent on business, competitiveness, investment, innovation. The Liberals were excited about innovation a few years ago. It seems to have dropped off the radar screen. The only mention of business in the throne speech was the government's intention to keep supporting and subsidizing some businesses that are struggling through the pandemic. And that's fine, but that's not really investing for the future. So I don't see a coherent or credible vision of where the country's going economically. Socially, it's a bit different. We've got a government, I think, in Ottawa that's primarily focused on social objectives at the moment. And in BC, it's kind of a similar picture to some extent. So we certainly don't have the urgency that I think is warranted about reinvigorating the capital stock, investing more so our workers are more productive and can earn more, and making sure we've got a suite of export industries that can generate the income we need to maintain our living standards.
So I understand companies and organizations from outside of Canada saying, yeah, you don't look so attractive from over here. What I find particularly disturbing is that we see more and more, and a lot of it here in British Columbia, is major organizations are quietly, because they're not advertising what they're doing, investing elsewhere. They're de-investing here. They're pulling back resources from the organizations that they operate here. This is where they made their money. And yet they're saying our future growth potential isn't in British Columbia and is not even in Canada. This is a troubling sign, and it's one that bothers me.
Yeah, no, and it's something that requires a lot more attention than we're giving it today, I think, in the public domain. The picture is a little bit more complex. I mean, there are global companies that are investing in Canada. Amazon and Microsoft are two that are quite prominent here in British Columbia. And again, these are in the non-permit economy, to use my terminology. Across large parts of the resource economy and much of manufacturing, we are seeing the weakness on capital formation, relatively little incoming investment from foreign firms, and quite rightly, as you point out, in some sectors, certainly forestry in BC, we've seen the major companies increasingly investing elsewhere. Now there's a push-pull phenomenon at work there. It's not just, there are opportunities these companies are taking advantage of. They've grown in size. Got to remember, Canada's 2% of the world's economy.
Right.
BC is 10% of 2%, so we're a pretty small player. And substantial companies that reach a size quite naturally are going to be looking at other markets they might want to do business in. But I also think in our case we're chasing them out to some extent through the creation of very unappealing business environments, especially for companies in these permit industries that require a lot of interface. So it's happening nationally, and it's certainly happening in BC. And the question I have, our provincial government talks about value added in the forest industry, and I've heard that through my entire career from governments of different stripes. If you want to drive a value-added strategy in an industry like forestry, who do you think is going to do it? Is it the public service? No. Is it environmental activist groups? No. It's actually the companies, the biggest, best capitalized, best managed companies in the industry today. They have the knowledge, they understand the markets, they have the business acumen, and most importantly, they have the capital to actually drive any strategy government wants. In BC, the government seems to be in a kind of war situation or a conflict situation with the biggest companies in our #1 export industry. That bothers me. And I don't think it's, and it just doesn't just affect forestry. It spreads out and I would say contaminates the business environment to some extent right across the private sector. That I don't think our decision makers in Victoria understand.
No, it's my understanding they talk about value added, as you say, I've been hearing it my entire life, and yet those very companies have moved that value added work just across the border, no more than about 90 miles away. Quietly haven't gone and done that. Why? Because there's a more business-friendly environment in that jurisdiction than the one that they're dealing with here, which is the source of the product that they're working with.
Yeah, it's not that the BC environment for anybody operating on the land base, and again, this is the kind of permit economy, has become an incredibly complex place to do business, to get stuff done, even to run an existing business, never mind try and expand it or change the shape of it.
Or create a new one.
The regulatory environment is complicated. We've got unresolved Aboriginal right and title issues that pervade the whole Crown land base, and there's no easy fix to that. That's something we just have to manage our way through. In some cases, we have unattractive kind of taxation structures, and I just find it odd that our provincial government would look at the number one export engine in BC, which is still forestry. By forestry, I mean logging, wood products manufacturing, and pulp and paper all lumped together. That's a third of our exports. It's a pretty big number.
Yeah.
That the government would look at that and not say, we need to help these companies succeed. We want them to stay here. We want them to invest here. Yes, the fiber supply is going to go down over time because of the pine beetle and because of other decisions around land use, but we can still have a thriving, commercially successful, and energized forest products industry in BC. It might not be as big in relative terms as it was when I was growing up here, 60 years ago, but it can still make a big contribution. But the track we're on right now, I think we're going to lose that opportunity because these companies all the signals from government are that you should basically take your marbles and go somewhere else, which is precisely what they're going to do.
Well, and that's what they are doing. What I find even more disturbing, and it's not exactly in line with what we're talking about, but we look at the government of Canada, we look at the government of British Columbia. They have infrastructure commitments that they have made, and they're not executing. They're not investing in Canada either. Now, they're not taking that money elsewhere, but they're not putting the money into the economy. They're not helping to drive innovation. They're not building jobs and further taxation. Even they are not contributing the way that we need to continue to see.
I must say, you're a pretty harsh critic of our. I wouldn't go quite that far. I mean, I think I think governments are both federally and certainly here in BC, they are allocating more capital. They're increasing their capital budgets and spending. We've seen that in BC. It's been quite appreciable, and I think that makes sense in the environment we're in today. BC's actually done, I think, a reasonable job of that. I mean, there's work being done on transportation projects. There's work being done to build new hospitals and so on. The federal government, I think, struggles more. They really have enormous difficulty flipping the lights on in the morning. So the Canada Infrastructure Bank, created 6 years ago, I think in Mr. Trudeau's first budget, $35 billion commitment earmarked from the government of Canada to start the infrastructure bank, and then it was going to leverage in private capital to help invest in all kinds of different projects. But they've been incredibly slow to get going. I think there's only 4 or 5 projects that they've even got out the door yet. They've had a complete turnover of the board and of senior management. It's classic Ottawa, basically sclerotic decision-making and institutions that struggle to execute. And in that regard, Canada's got the disadvantages. We're known rightly as a very slow-moving jurisdiction. When we move at all, it's slow. But we're in a fast-changing world where opportunities come, they're kind of fleeting. If you want to be a leader, whether it's on the low-carbon transition or the digital economy or anything else, you can't ponder and reflect on it for 36 months and then kind of incrementally work away. You've got to make some big, bold bets. And as a country, I think we really struggle with that.
I want to just sort of go back to, in the little bit of time that we have left, what this climate is and relationship between business and government. I have heard, and I'm aware of, some senior business people in this province saying, well, the Premier won't return a phone call. But in other jurisdictions, the Premier's counterpart calls to say, how can we help? How much do we need to see a shift in attitude towards business? And if doing so, well, then that brings some of the legislative changes. Because I think that we, as you point out, I'm being a little harsh here, but with a change in attitude and with some regulatory changes, we can probably change this environment.
I think the problem is, if you read the mandate letters that the Premier wrote and delivered to all his ministers, and you read the ones that Mr. Trudeau is about to send to his ministers at the federal level, you'll see mandate letters that aren't really focused very much on building the economy. They don't say, we want to step up investment and capital formation so that we can raise productivity. They don't say we want to be more competitive so we can attract investment. Those are not priorities, seemingly, of the current political leadership at either at the federal level or here in BC. And I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity, because the people we're competing with around the world are more focused on those things. And especially for an NDP government here in BC that wants workers to have higher wages and incomes over time, a goal I subscribe to as well. The only way to get that is to have more investment in things that make workers more productive. And that should be an actual central driver of every decision the province makes. And so far, I think they've really struggled to see that. So we keep working away at it, but we are losing ground, there's no question.
Well, and I think it's very interesting. We look at that socialist mecca, Sweden, they get it. And they're an attractive place to invest, and their economy continues to seem to do quite well, considering
Norway, Denmark, Ireland, Germany. Social Democratic government is about to take over in Germany. Its relations, I would predict, with the corporate sector in Germany will be smoother and less conflict prone than we tend to see in Canada or certainly BC. So I think we're up against a very competitive, a very harsh world. Borders are thickening. Mr. Trudeau is discovering that the departure of Donald Trump from the White House has not created a much better atmosphere for dealing with bilateral trade and commercial issues. In fact, it's gotten worse, believe it or not, since Trump left. We have no traction at all in Washington. We can't get pipelines built across the U.S. Hydro-Quebec was just shut down on an attempt to build a clean energy transmission infrastructure into the New England states. President Biden wants to subsidize electric vehicle manufacturing, but only in the United States, kind of ignoring the free trade agreement we have with the U.S. So we better pretty quickly figure out a way that we're going to make our way in the world, compete, and earn our living, because no one's going to do it for us. And at the moment, especially at the national level, what I see is a government that's basically spinning its wheels completely, and they're just not focused on the things that I think we need to be focused on if we care about productivity, investment, wages, and incomes. And to some extent, I'd make that comment provincially as well.
I think I want to thank you for coming in here, John, but I wish that we were ending on a higher note.